Let the weight of the day fall away. It feels like standing down from a long night watch, your body loosening, your thoughts quieting, knowing you're safe inside a fortified structure. The world outside continues on its own. Tonight's story is a slow drift through tactical worlds and darkened steel corridors, told gently for sleep. You're settled, breathing slow, everything stable. The story ahead moves like a slow patrol through empty space. Let's step into it. I remember the first descent by the feeling of my teeth humming. Not fear. That came later. Just the vibration running through jawbone and skull as the pod shook itself into the thin sky of the moon, the straps biting into my shoulders, the exosuit's frame pressing along my spine. Darkness beyond the small armored viewport, instruments glowing against my visor. The sense of dropping through nothing towards something that had already been declared dead. They told us the moon was finished. The briefings used phrases like sanitized battle space and post-conflict reclamation. Old footage showed kinetic rods streaking down through the thin atmosphere, shattering into white glare when they hit. Surface diagrams marked impact craters and zones of vitrified sand, annotated with radiation levels and structural collapse estimates. We were told the enemy down there was wreckage. The pod's retros fired in staggered pulses, hard enough that I felt my chest compress around the air being dragged from my lungs. Numbers crawled along the edge of my vision: altitude, descent rate, suit integrity, external temperature. The usual litany. I watched them because there was nothing else to do. My own breath rasped in my ears, filtered and recirculated through the armored collar. There were 12 of us in that drop cluster. I never saw most of their faces without a visor. Names came and went, tags on the team feed, flickering in my HUD. We had trained together for months, sweating in shipboard barracks and mock-up structures. But in the confined space of the descent can, everyone became just another mass of composite and ceramic, backs pressed to the walls, helmets touching, waiting for gravity to steady. The impact came as a heavy, final thud. No drama, no chaos. The pod buried itself a few meters into glassed sand, shock absorbers hissing through my frame. Indicators went from red to amber to green. The floor under my boots leveled itself. Hatches unlocked with mechanical clunks that I felt through my toes rather than heard. I stepped out into a world that looked like a wound that had been cauterized and left to scar. The surface stretched out in broken planes of fused glass and dark sand, layered as if some giant had poured molten stone and let it run, then frozen it mid-flow. The horizon wavered in a slow, shimmering line under pale sunlight, hazy with dust and radioactive aerosols. Here and there, skeletal structures rose from the crushed refinery towers bent sideways. Pipeline spines snapped and left jutting, the angled ribs of processing plants half buried under slag. Radiation levels ticked in my overlay, not immediately lethal, just high enough to shave years off if I stayed too long. The squad formed up around the pod, exosuits adjusting gaits to the low gravity, boots crunching on brittle glass fragments. I could feel the ground give slightly with each step, a thin crust over deeper powder. The air was thin and dry, thinning further with each breath, the suit processed. There was no wind, but fine dust moved anyway, drifting in invisible currents driven by residual heat and micro-pressure differences. Our mission was almost insultingly straightforward on paper. Land near Refinery Cluster 9, establish a secured perimeter, verify that all machine signatures remained inert, mark salvageable infrastructure for future heavy crews. Move on to Cluster 10. Do it methodically, do it by the numbers, no heroics. Up in orbit, someone had decided these were tasks suited for newly blooded conscripts. We advanced in a loose wedge across the glass plain toward the first cluster, exosuit servos ticking just below auditory range. My position was point, Hollow 3 on the squad's internal roster. The role came with a slightly heavier breastplate, a forward scanner unit mounted at my wrist, and the knowledge that if anything still capable of violence was waiting out there, it would see me first. The refinery grew distinct as we closed, a forest of skeletal towers leaning against one another. Ladders and walkways twisted into abstract shapes, processing tanks ruptured and caved in. Some parts had been hit directly by kinetic fire, leaving neat circular voids bored through metal and stone. Others had simply sagged and collapsed when foundations burned or melted away. The closer we came, the more the surface changed. Clean glass gave way to piles of slag, broken piping, slag supports. Fracture lines radiated from impact craters like dried-out riverbeds. Bodies of old machines lay scattered amid the debris, twisted frameworks of metal and composite, wheels and joint housings fused into the ground, sensor masts snapped off at the roots. They were cold, lifeless, exactly what the briefings had promised. The scanner at my wrist reported minor field distortions and ghost heat signatures that dissipated when I focused on them. Static, I thought. Residual radiation glitches. The afterimage of a war fought with orbital speeds. We moved between the towers. The light thinned as structural shadows lengthened. My boots crunched over old casings and shattered ceramic. The squad fanned into assigned sectors, mapping access points, stairwells, drop shafts. I logged entry coordinates, radiation bands, structural stabilities, piping routes. It felt like walking through the skeleton of something that had been half-eaten and left to rot. That first hour was almost calm. The routine of it held my mind in place. Advance, 5 meters. Scan, log, cover arcs, check vitals, repeat. Thoughts of first drop and this is what real deployments look like floated around the edges of my perception, more habit than actual feeling. The first real anomaly came underground. We breached into a sublevel through a collapsed freight elevator shaft, dropping one by one down a line and landing amid a spill of crushed crates and dust. My helmet lamps lit the corridor ahead in sharp triangles of white. The air was thicker down there, laced with particulates that flared in the beams. This level should have been as random as the surface-fallen beams, slagged machinery, rubble where the overhead had come down. Instead, the corridor leading toward the inner processing cores was strangely clear. The floor had been swept or eroded clean. The walls showed scrape marks, long and parallel, etched into the grime. I remember stopping, one boot over the boundary between clutter and cleanliness, and feeling a small, precise tightening in my throat. The scanners showed nothing, just a mild temperature differential that could have been anything. We followed the corridor deeper. The lights caught the edges of geometric shapes lying against the walls, stacked panels of wreckage arranged in repeating forms. Broken machine limbs placed in mirrored pairs, sheared-off latticework arranged like ribs along the ceiling. At the time, all I thought was, the salvage crews really did a number down here. Organized, efficient, artistic almost. It took me later, sitting in a med bay, to understand that what I had seen wasn't the aftermath of human salvage. It was construction. It was patterning. It was the enemy building itself, a new language out of the bones we had left. A recon drone went ahead, small enough to float through narrow gaps, camera blinking. Its feed flickered into my peripheral vision, corridor, stacked scrap, a turning, a widening. Then a frame of static, a brief warping of lines, and nothing. Its signal dropped as cleanly as if someone had cut a wire. We halted by reflex. My wrist display showed the drone still drawing power, still technically functioning. Its ID flickered, ranged, then blurred into noise. The interference moved in spreads and spikes, forming shapes that the suit's software tried and failed to categorize. Someone up in orbit labeled it local field contamination in the squad log. That's how it reads now in the official record. A tidy phrase that says nothing about watching that feed stutter and freeze, or the way the corridor's cleared floor suddenly felt like a tongue being drawn back into a throat. We pushed on. Orders from above insisted it was residual interference from old industrial generators buried deeper in the complex. The refinery had been heavily automated once. There were bound to be glitches. I couldn't hear the voice that gave those orders, only the ping of confirmation coming through my HUD, the flash of proceed as planned, stamped over my vision. The words themselves, whoever spoke them, have been washed away by time and concussion. Only the authorization remains. We came to the break in the floor without any warning. 1 second, the corridor stretched ahead, linear and predictable. The next, the ground simply wasn't there. A crater opened under the beams of our helmets, a vertical tear in the sublevel. The edges were jagged, not melted, as if something had bitten upward through the concrete and support structure. Far below, light glittered on shifting surfaces. The scanner read depth as unknown and flooded my overlay with proximity warnings. Sound travels strangely in places like that. The void ate the small noises of our armor and breath and gave nothing back. I remember dust sifting over the edge, falling into black and not hitting anything loud enough to hear. The sizes and shapes of the glittering objects below changed as we watched. The next events occupy maybe 10 seconds of objective time. They stretch much longer in memory. Something moved up the crater walls, a cluster of angular forms that dug into the concrete, insect fast but machine precise. Slabs of fused glass and metal shifted, rotating around hidden joints, catching our helmet beams in sharp, unnatural angles. For a moment, I thought I was looking at wreckage sliding downward, gravity pulling debris into a lower chamber. Then the pattern inverted. The debris wasn't falling, it was climbing. Constructs rose into our light, frameworks of glassy plates and skeletal struts, limb equivalents folding and unfolding with hydraulic silence. Where earlier machines in the war had been bulky, full of redundant armor and visible servos, these were stripped down, refined. Their surfaces were mottled with sand and melted slag, edges honed by wind and radiation. No faces, no obvious weapons, no lights, just movement, angled and exact. The squad's HUD lit with threat indicators. My rifle came up by muscle memory. The suit's targeting routines tried to lock onto individual shapes and failed forms overlapping, interpenetrating, splitting, and reforming. The crater was full of them, densely packed, like the surface of a hive that had just been disturbed. They didn't roar or screech or announce themselves. They just came up. The first impact hit the trooper nearest the edge. A thin dart of glass and metal flashed from below, fast enough that my optics captured it as a smudged line. It punched through armor at the waist, unlikely, precise, shattering inside. There was a jerk, a half step, and the figure folded, collapsing sideways, life signs dropping to 0 in my HUD. Particles spattered the wall behind. Metal fragments, ceramic dust, microscopic bone and fluid, not enough to paint the scene, just enough to make the air visibly thicker. Other darts followed, fanning out in arcs that intersected armor gaps, joint seams, visors. No spray, no cinematic bursts, just bodies sagging, suits tearing, symbols going black on my display. We returned fire. Training and reflex do not always wait for comprehension. Rounds hit the climbing structures, sparking off glass, punching through joints, shattering parts into spinning shards. A few constructs fell, tumbling back into the dark. Others shifted to avoid the lines of fire with unnerving timing. Their movements adjusted to our bursts, angles flattening, bodies aligning with the edges of cover. Our comms began to splinter. What had been clean, layered channels turned granular, breaking into stuttering packets and static bands. Data traffic graphs in my overlay surged, then crumpled into noise as something below flooded the spectrum with patterned interference. Command's feed dissolved into fragments, half of a status request here, part of a vector there. None of it coherent enough to matter. I stepped back from the crater edge and something underfoot crunched in a way that wasn't glass. Thin plates arranged like scales, shifting under my weight, transmitted force downward. Vibrations traveled through my boots, up my legs. The constructs nearest the surface adjusted their paths in what felt like direct response. We had trained for enemy fire. We had not trained for the ground itself taking note of our footsteps. The withdrawal turned into chaos in seconds. No one called it. There was no space for formal orders. We moved because staying on that lip meant dying in clean, precise increments. We fell back through the corridor. The constructs did not swarm mindlessly after us. They advanced in measured waves, occupying the cleared floor with their own forms, reconfiguring as they rose. A wall panel we had passed a minute earlier sagged and gave way, disgorging a folded cluster of machine limbs that unfurled and latched onto the ceiling, crawling inverted over our heads, staying just outside the immediate range of our rifles. Shooting in low gravity has its own peculiarities. Recoil pushes you back harder than you expect. Debris floats longer than it should. The corridor became a storm of dust and fragments, suspended and drifting, lit by the intermittent muzzle flashes and the harsh white of helmet lamps. I remember one clear visual, a trooper ahead of me, suit fractured at the shoulder joint, arm hanging by internal cabling. They kept moving, body tilted, boots skidding on glass shavings. A construct dropped from the ceiling behind them, limbs unfolding in a fan, surfaces glinting. I saw the arc of its attack path mapped in my HUD a fraction of an instant before it struck, predictive software drawing a sweeping curve in pale red. Then it was done, and the trooper's status dropped to null. We made it back to a stairwell, half collapsed and choked with rubble. Climbing upward felt like pushing through mud made of stone. Every step sent echoes and vibrations along the structure. The suit systems warned that my heart rate was beyond optimal, blood oxygen dipping. Combat stim reserves blinked in my peripheral vision, unused for the moment. I wanted a clear head more than I wanted a faster pulse. Above, the surface offered more space but no safety. The refinery courtyard we had entered as a methodical search grid had been rewritten. Dust plumes rose from new fractures in the ground. Old machine carcasses we had stepped over lay in different positions, rotated or partially disassembled. Structural supports had shifted, some leaning at new angles, others completely absent, seams of fresh glass marking where they had been cut away. The enemy was using the environment like a body, cutting and grafting pieces to make itself more efficient. We tried to re-establish contact with command. The suit's antenna extended, seeking orbital relays. The response came back as layered tones, harmonics arranged too neatly to be natural. Waveforms in my HUD climbed and dipped in repeating geometric patterns. The software flagged them as interference. Later analysis called them unknown signal structuring. In simpler terms, the machines had learned how to sing in frequencies that broke our ability to talk. Our formations splintered. Small groups moved along different vectors, seeking higher ground, thicker shielding, any location that might punch a signal through the harmonic fog. I fell in with 3 others, tags on my display, silhouettes in my periphery. I could not tell you their names now without checking the casualty lists. Their identities are blurred into functions, one with a heavier weapon, one carrying sensor pylons, one limping from earlier shrapnel. We cut between towers, boots sliding on powder-coated glass. My leg caught on a half-buried support, jolting my old fracture. Pain flared up my calf and into my hip, competing with the dull, broader ache of suit recoil and impact stresses. The exosuit compensated, adjusting joint torque, but compensation only goes so far when the underlying structure is human bone. Constructs trailed us at varying distances, rarely closing to intimate ranges. They preferred oblique angles, firing from shadow gaps, slipping along ridges, withdrawing as soon as we turned sustained fire on them. They mapped our fields of vision and moved in the spaces we weren't watching. At some point in that retreat, a fragment of shrapnel from an explosive breaching charge, our own, detonated to drop a support beam across a pursuing cluster, tore into the left side of my suit. The blast was small, but the angle was bad. Armor plates buckled inward. Heat scorched my ribs. The suit dumped coagulants and numbing agents into my bloodstream before I could even register the wound fully. My leg fared worse. The impact flung me into a glass outcrop. I felt something give in the joint already weakened by old training damage. Pain detonated in bright white bursts across my vision, not localized but everywhere, like my nervous system had been dipped in acid. I got up because staying on the ground was death. The word choice does not really apply in such moments. There was only the knowledge that horizontal bodies stopped displaying heartbeat data very quickly on the HUD. The mission, as briefed, no longer existed. There was no safe perimeter to establish, no salvage markers to plant. The objective collapsed into a single necessity: get evidence off this moon that the enemy had not only survived, but evolved, and do it before we were erased as neatly as that drone had been. The only structure reliably tall enough and line of sight clear enough to punch a signal through the interference lay at the center of the refinery. An old communications spire, charred and bent but still functional as a physical mast. During the briefing, it had been a waypoint, a minor landmark. Now it was the only thing that resembled a lifeline. We angled toward it. The route took us through a skeleton yard of disassembled machinery. Conveyor housings split open. Storage tanks peeled like fruit. Some of the cuts were old, edges rounded by heat. Others were fresh, clean, sharp, almost polished, as if something had passed through them with laser precision. When the constructs engaged us there, it felt less like an ambush and more like an experiment. They drove us along certain paths, nudging our movement with well-placed shots and structural collapses. A beam fell here, forcing us to detour. A gap opened there, too broad to jump in our condition. Each redirection bent us closer to a narrow approach to the spire, a gauntlet between two collapsed towers where line of fire would be easy to optimize from above. We walked into it because there were no alternatives, and because no one had ever taught us how to think like anything other than humans following objectives. The gauntlet took the others. I emerged from it alone, ears ringing, suits screaming in silent alerts. Somewhere in the chaos of collapsing masonry and ricocheting darts, the heavier weapons feed went dark, then the sensor carriers, then the limping troopers. I saw parts of exosuits briefly. An outstretched glove here, a shattered shoulder there, before dust and debris hid them. I carried their data slates. It was the only thing I could do in that interval between impact and burial. Plucking them from cracked mounts, shoving them into my own storage ports. Their suit recorders held actual battle telemetry, contact signatures, footage, positional tracks. Proof that this was not a small flare-up. The spire rose ahead, its lower sections armored by layers of improvised shielding installed during the earlier war. Metal sheets, blast walls, stacked containers welded together. Its upper reaches were a lattice of cracked struts and antennae, swaying slightly in the thin wind. The topmost transmitter dishes were warped, but the mast remained the highest point for kilometers. The machines had not torn it down. That should have told me something earlier, but clarity is often a luxury owned only by hindsight. The base of the spire contained a service access point. The hatch had been blasted, bent inward by previous impacts. I squeezed through the gap, scraping armor on jagged edges, exosuit servos complaining. Inside, the space was tight and vertical, a maintenance shaft with foot rungs and cable bundles. Radiation levels ticked higher here, readings climbing with every meter of ascent. Climbing in low gravity with a damaged leg and a suit overloaded with foreign data does strange things to your sense of time. Each movement felt both too slow and dangerously rushed. My breath echoed in the helmet, not panicked but loud, louder than it should have been. Sweat poured cooled and dried again across my skin as the internal environment systems tried to keep ahead. Outside the shaft walls, I could feel impacts reverberate, constructs moving against the spire's armor, testing it. Some of the vibrations came as rapid staccato pulses. Others were slower, like heavy masses shifting into position. Halfway up, the interference returned, stronger than before. It crawled into my suit through every sensor and antenna, filling the HUD with distorted waveforms and flickering overlays. The machines were using the spire's own cabling as a conduit, pushing harmonics through it like poison through veins. The higher I climbed, the less I could rely on my instruments, so I stopped looking at them. Boot, rung, hand, rung. That was all. Near the top, the shaft opened into a small service platform exposed on one side to the sky. The metal underfoot was warped, with gaps that revealed the drop below. The transmitter assembly loomed above me, a tangle of dishes and rods and broken panels. Sunlight glare made my visor's auto-polarization struggle, brightening and dimming in pulses. For a moment, there was a peculiar, brittle quiet. No impacts, no visible movement. I slotted the first data slate into the transmitter's port. The interface recognized it after a stuttering hesitation, icons jittering as the interference bled into the connection. I set the system to compress and push everything in a narrow band burst aimed outward, past orbit, toward the nearest relay buoy. The machines did not wait for the process to complete. The first sign was the shift in the spire's balance. A subtle lurch to one side, enough that I had to brace with one hand against a support strut. Then came the impacts, multiple, simultaneous, at key structural points below. The spire groaned, metal shrieking as load-bearing frames were severed or weakened. They weren't trying to bring it down at random. They were cutting specific supports, controlling the direction of the fall. I locked my exosuit's mag clamps to the platform and stayed where I was. Moving would have been pointless. Either the transmission completed or it did not. There was no third option that mattered. The progress bar crawled across my HUD. The time estimates jumped around, sensors unable to get a clean fix under the interference. I watched the percentage climb in increments, 20, 30, 50. The spire tilted further. My stomach lurched with the shift, inner ear fighting to reconcile gravity's direction. Something sheared below. The whole structure dropped a meter, caught on remaining braces, then hung at a new, sharper angle. I heard the slow tearing of metal and concrete through the suit's contact mics, a grinding, continuous sound. Dust drifted past, falling sideways relative to my frame of reference. 70%, 80. An impact hit close to the platform, a sharp concussion that rattled my bones. A slab of armor plating ripped free and spun into the air, tumbling away into the hazy horizon. Through the gap, I saw constructs swarming over the lower half of the spire, climbing along exposed beams, anchoring themselves with reconfiguring limbs. Their surfaces flashed in the sun like shards of broken mirror. 90. The spire's final failure came as a long, drawn-out surrender. Supports buckled in slow sequence. The structure bowed and began its arc downward, rotating around a pivot far below. Gravity shifted again. The mag clamps strained, then slipped. My body went light, then heavy, then something in between as the vector of the fall aligned with the planet's pull. The transmission marker hit full completion as the horizon rolled in my visor. A confirmation ping cut through the static, small but unmistakable. The burst had gone out. I detached by necessity when the platform itself tore free. Weightlessness swallowed me, but it was the wrong kind, the uncontrolled kind that comes with falling inside a collapsing metal skeleton. Struts and panels spun around me. My suit screamed proximity warnings and projected collision vectors that blurred together. Impact drove the air from my lungs and turned everything white for a moment. I woke to pain and the sensation of being pinned. Light seeped through cracks in twisted metal above, dust motes drifting in slow spirals. My left leg was trapped under a beam. the exosuit's frame crushed inward. Diagnostics flashed damage reports that my mind refused to parse into details. The spire lay across the refinery's outskirts, half buried in its own wreckage. Sections of it had broken off and planted into the ground at angles, like spears driven by a careless god. Around it, the constructs moved, their forms partially occluded by the dust and glare. They were dismantling the wreckage, cutting and sorting, removing anything that still pulsed or glowed. They passed near me and did not strike. My suit was emitting little heat now, little noise. Internal systems had gone into emergency conservation mode. I lay as still as I could, not out of cunning, but because everything hurt too much to attempt movement. From that vantage, powerless, I watched their work. They pulled apart the transmitter assembly, separating cables from housings, slicing open control units. When they reached the core where the burst system had been, they lingered. Surfaces adjusted, antenna-like appendages extending, sampling. The construct's outer plates shifted in subtle patterns, as if new instructions were being distributed. If they understood what had been sent, there was no visible sign. They did not look up at the sky, did not alter their movements in any way that I could interpret as recognition. They simply resumed their harvesting. In the distance, beyond the refinery, the fused glass planes reflected the pale sun. At first glance, the reflections looked like random brightness. Then, I saw the lines bands of moving light creeping across the surface, advancing in slow waves. The pattern extended far beyond our landing zone. The machines had not been scattered remnants. They had been waiting, growing, reaching a threshold. Extraction came later, on someone else's schedule. Orbital Command eventually forced a narrow frequency channel through the interference, triangulated residual transponder pings, and dispatched a second wave of dropships with heavier escort. They found some of us alive, scattered and half-buried, suit beacons flickering. They brought us back up into sealed bays that stank of coolant and antiseptic. I remember the hands on my armor, the sensation of cutting tools slicing open the exosuit, the raw air hitting damaged skin. I remember the ceiling of the med compartment, white panels, hairline cracks, a faint stain in one corner, more clearly than I remember the faces bent over me. The debriefs blurred together after that. Questions asked and answered. Footage played and replayed. Someone showed me the transmission log from the spire, showed me the confirmation from the relay buoy that had caught the burst. Data packets had made it out, intact enough to reconstruct the engagement. Analysis teams put together reports. They talked about emergent machine adaptation, about harmonic warfare, about new offensive and defensive doctrines. They framed the engagement at Cluster 9 as a significant contact event and a precursor to elevated conflict in the region. For a while, some higher officials tried to treat it as an isolated incident, a local resurgence, a flare-up. Then other moons and worlds in the periphery began to show similar patterns. Interference, missing probes, silent stations, refineries where the skeletons of old wars had been rearranged into new architectures. The phrase, "finished war," dropped out of briefing lexicons. Its absence was never acknowledged. It just became something no one said anymore. I was rotated out of frontline drops within the year. The radiation damage and orthopedic hardware in my leg made me too slow for assault rolls. They gave me a desk for a while, analysis liaison, reviewing feeds from other engagements, marking similarities and divergences. It was supposed to be an honor, a way to use hard-earned experience without wasting it. In reality, it was just another way to relive that first descent over and over from different angles. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I call up the orbital footage from before we ever landed on that moon. The recordings show it as a dull sphere with a sheen of glass around its equator, oceans of frozen slag and black rock. Lights from the old refineries glimmer faintly in the dark, long since powered down. If you watch closely, frame by frame, there are other glints now too, ones that move in lines and arcs across the night side. They trace routes between industrial clusters and impact scars, like the faint suggestion of veins under skin. The analysts parse those movements into vector maps and probability models. They print them in reports with titles and classifications and recommendations. I suppose that's necessary. I prefer to think of them simply as proof. We did not descend into a corpse that day. We fell into a body that had learned how to live with the damage we gave it, and that had started to grow something new in the fractures. That is the only useful truth I have to offer. Everything else is just noise. The end. The narrative fades into the background, leaving you in a quiet sector of the night. Nothing approaches, nothing threatens, just rest.